big changes just happened within the real estate industry not too long ago, especially if you're buying a house hack, your own home, or an investment property. And this is all as a result from this $418 million lawsuit against the National Association of Realtors, and this is going to be the new normal for buying real estate. So if this is the new standard, you gotta be prepared. And this video is preparing everyone out there for buying real estate, no matter what kind of purchase it is. This is going to be the new normal, and I wanna make sure you go through it with confidence. So let's get right into it. Alright, so big changes happen within the real estate industry, and the destination is the same where you're purchasing a property, but the route will be different. I'll be going over the big changes that are happening, especially when you're buying real estate, but make sure you stay through the whole video because I'm going to be providing a lot of my opinions on how to navigate all of this and even a sample transaction of what that might all look like, especially if you're a new buyer entering to the market or if you're a repeat buyer. It's going to be a lot different than what you are used to. There are three major changes that are happening within the real estate industry, and the first is that the buyer and the real estate agent must have a written agreement with each other as far as compensation goes before any home tours happen. And before this change, I like to meet my buyer at the first house that we want to tour before any sort of written agreement happens, because it shows that I have the expertise in this community or in this house or the type of strategy my client wants to use. And it also shows me what the buyer also wants out of a certain house, and it just gets them used to the feel of going through showings and touring homes. But now there has to be some sort of relationship before going into these home tours. And with you watching these YouTube videos, you know a lot about me. So I feel like this is a really good way for me to get an understanding of who you are. I mean, with whether we meet in person or a Zoom meeting or anything like that, I feel like this is a really good way for us to establish that relationship. And I know talking about compensation is a touchy subject. I mean, with the part of the commissions and me finding the best property for you and analyzing deals, especially if it's an investment property or a house hack, I'm bringing my expertise to the table and we can negotiate what those compensations look like. But the thing is, every buyer agent has to go through all of this process now. So they have to have a written agreement before you tour any homes, and that written agreement will have some sort of compensation for the buyer agent. And back in the day, if you're brand new to this whole process, the seller would pay for both the listing agent and the buyer agent. And that's very general. I mean, like, there's a lot more nuance to it, but in essence, the seller would pay the listing agent for a certain fee, let's say it's 6%, and then the listing agent would bring 3% of that, or whatever they want, to the buyer agent and as a sort of like, thank you for bringing a buyer to my seller's property. So the big advantage with having this buyer agreement signed by both the buyer agent and the buyer is that now we're all in. We are in this sort of partnership with each other. And after everything is signed, you can expect my undivided attention. I mean, you would have gotten it already, but it gives me confidence that I will be compensated at the end of the transaction when everything's all said and done and I find you the perfect property. And like I mentioned earlier, the point of compensation is sort of a brand new situation for the buyer side. Usually buyers didn't have to bring anything to the table for their representation, meaning the buyer agent. But now, things are a little different. So I'm going to be going into the second point of the big changes with this new real estate world. So in practice now, the second point that I want to harp on is that compensation will be paid for by the seller or the buyer and not just the seller. So there's not going to be any sort of like cooperation or sharing of commissions where that situation that I mentioned earlier where the seller would pay the listing agent and then the listing agent would give a portion of their fee to the buyer agent. That's that cooperation or that old world style. So the chances are the seller will be paying for the seller agency, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're paying for the representation that you want during this whole transaction. But now the buyer agency has to be compensated somehow, and whether it comes from the buyer or the seller, they have to be compensated for guiding you through the transaction, representing you through everything, and negotiating for everything that you want on your behalf. So how does the buyer agent get compensated? It could come in three ways. Number one, the seller could pay for it. Number two, the buyer could pay for it. Or number three, a combination of both the seller and buyer can pay for the buyer agency. This is huge. This is a lot different than what we're used to before August 17th of 2024, maybe just like a month ago. It's crazy how much of a change this is, but nonetheless, this is all to be fully transparent with the buyer and the buyer agency. This all needs to be agreed upon before any showings happen. So having this conversation means that everyone's on the same side, you have that increased transparency of how everything works, and you have those expectations set so that no one is blindsided with certain fees at the closing table. I can foresee that it can be a tense conversation, but everything is negotiable and we want to make sure that everyone is fairly compensated and everything just goes according to plan. And speaking of negotiation, the buyer can actually have the seller pay for the buyer agency in the form of a higher offer price and then discounting the offer price with the seller credit and having that credit go towards the buyer agency. And seller concessions or seller credits, whatever you want to call it, is a normal thing. I've asked for a lot of seller credits on my buyer's behalf in order for them to get a lower interest rate or their closing costs reduced. And another thing too is that the seller kind of wants to have that added aspect of like, hey, if I pay for the buyer's agency, the buyer doesn't have to come so much out of pocket, which attracts a lot more buyers to their property. So let's say, for example, you're a buyer in this market, right? So if you understand from your own agent who has had a conversation with the seller saying that, hey, the seller is not looking to pay for my representation of you, the buyer. So the seller is somewhat inclined to pay for the buyer agency. I mean, imagine if you were a buyer and you see that, hey, the seller's not willing to pay for the buyer agency, you have to come more out of pocket. And when you know that you have to come out of pocket with down payment, closing costs, home inspection, and now the buyer agency, you're just priced way out and it's just not as attractive anymore. It's just a lot more money up front. So if the listing agent comes to the buyer agent and says, hey, the seller's able to pay for the buyer agency in this transaction, then more buyers will come to the table, they will receive more offers, and they can see what sort of bidding war can happen in order to get the highest price. So now let's put some numbers behind it, right? Let's say there's a $500,000 property and the listing agent is getting paid, let's say 3% on the whole transaction. And that's a pretty normal amount. Sometimes you see 2.8%, sometimes you see 2.5%, but let's say the seller is willing to give 2.5% to the buyer agency for the buyer's representation. And let's say in that written agreement between the buyer and the buyer agent says, hey, 2.5% is my commission. That's how much I work for in regards to my expertise. I feel like this is a fair amount, blah, blah, blah. If the seller is willing to pay that 2.5%, then the buyer doesn't have to come out of pocket for those services. But let's say the seller is not willing to do that, then the down payment, let's say the buyer wants to put down 5% on a property. 5% on a $500,000 property is $25,000, and then $10,000 on closing costs, and then another $15,000 in agent representation or agent compensation. That's like $50,000 that the buyer would have to come out of pocket. I mean, it saves like $15,000 for the buyer, and it just makes a lot of sense for sellers to make that compensation in order to get more offers on their home. And then one more piece that I want to bring up through this whole new industry-wide standard is that compensation of the buyer's agency will not be provided on the MLS. I'm already seeing it on contracts, like that compensation field is completely blank or completely gone from contracts, so it is a normal thing now. It's not a huge deal. I mean, buyer agency compensation just can't be placed on the MLS. It could be listed on, let's say, YouTube videos, on social media channels, anywhere else that's within the sphere but not publicized. And let's say the property is on the MLS, the buyer agent can call up the listing agent and be like, hey, just wanted to see if there's any sort of buyer agency compensation. What does that all look like so I can set the tone and expectations with my buyer, and everything is upfront. So that's about it. Just wrapping things up, number one is that there has to be some sort of written agreement between the buyer and buyer agents before any home tours happen, especially with that exclusive right to buy. Number two is that compensation must be addressed within that written agreement. And also number three is that that compensation can't be posted onto the MLS, but it can be vocalized or written out or something like that. It just can't be on the MLS. So if you have any questions regarding this, please let me know in the comments below, or if you want to send me a text, shoot me an email, call me, text me if you want to reach me. I am here for you, and I want to make sure you make the right financial decision. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.